Kia ora, g'day and welcome to the history of Aotearoa, New Zealand, Episode 7, Tuatara. Now, in the last episode, I did say that I wouldn't be back until this weekend to talk about the Māori creation myth. However, I was having a Twitter conversation tonight about Tuatara and a variety of other things, and I was persuaded by the French History podcast to do a probably going to be roughly half an hour, maybe, episode on Tuatara specifically, because that's what I used to talk about a lot at one of my previous jobs. We had we had 5 Tuatara that we would talk about with people and show them, and we actually pull them out and give you a really close-up look. So this is going to be as you probably already noticed, a very off-the-cuff sort of episode. There's going to be all the ahs and ums and everything else that would normally be cut out from the regular episodes. And that's because, partially because this has been developed, or been, I guess, changed from my tours that I used to do at my previous job, so that's kind of where that's coming from, so it's a more authentic experience, but also because it's currently 9:30 at night on a Tuesday. I have work in the morning and I should be ironing my shirts and making sandwiches for tomorrow, so I don't want to be doing too much editing tonight, so we're just gonna make this real rough. It's just gonna be me basically rambling about something that I'm very, very passionate about, which is kind of already what the podcast is already, if you've gotten this far and listened to all the other ones, but this is going to be a lot more rough and a lot more not as good, basically. Let's put it that way, let's be honest. So French History Podcast, here you go, this is what you asked for. I'm doing it right now, and we're going to talk about Tuatara for maybe about 30 minutes. That's usually how long it took me to do it on to talk to people about Tuatara at my old job during my tours. So, to start with, this will be a lot, or some of it will be a repeat from episode 1. We've talked a little bit about Tuatara and what the sort of flora and fauna was like in New Zealand prior to any sort of human settlement. And I'll try and put some pictures up on Facebook and Twitter of Tuatara. The actual one of them is actually, for the picture for episode 1 on the website, is actually one of the Tuatara I used to look after. And that's a really cool picture because he's got his spines raised and this sort of stuff, and I'll explain that in a minute. So that's really, really cool. And I'll try and put up some sort of pictures page on the website or something, so that, when we're going to look at maps and stuff, we'll have some sort of pictures on it on the website that I can refer you to, but I haven't figured that out yet, so we'll get there eventually. So, to now start with, what is Tuatara? What does it mean? Well, Tuatara is Māori for peaks on the back or spiny back, depending on how you want to interpret it. So these guys are only found in New Zealand. They're a reptile that's only found in New Zealand. They're kind of a funny looking reptile. You can definitely tell that they're a reptile, but if you compare them to anything else, their closest living relative is crocodiles. So, crocodiles and alligators and that sort of stuff. And they kind of look like that, but kind of not really. There's nowhere that they sort of fit in. And that's, as we've mentioned in the first episode, that's because they're actually not lizards. They don't fit into any other nice little niche, like in the sort of tree of life, if you will. So they're actually classed as their own sort of genus, I think it is. I think it's genus. So they're classed as their own genus. Basically, if you have reptiles at the top, and then you have all the other sections beneath it, you've got lizards and snakes and crocodiles and other stuff. Well, Tuatara sit on that same level. They're the same, they're on that same level. So they're not very closely related to your bearded dragon or your blue tongue lizards or anything like that you'll find in Australia or anywhere else. They actually they're very weird and they're their own thing. So they're called sphenodons. That's their genus name at the front. And then there's different species. There's 3 different species within that, depending on who you ask. They can be 3 separate species, they can be 2 separate species, or they can actually be 1 species with three different subspecies. It really depends on which scientist you ask at the time, what's kind of the in vogue sort of thing at the time. But it's very dependent on who you ask and why and all this sort of stuff, as science tends to be, as history tends to be, quite a lot as well. So it's generally accepted that there's roughly 3 species or 3 subspecies that you can categorize them into. So we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute as well. So Tuatara are really interesting because they're what they call living fossils, and by that I mean that they haven't evolved much since they arose about 250 million years ago. So they're very, very old, and evolutionarily speaking, I guess you want to say that. You hear a lot that birds are the sort of descendants of dinosaurs. That you go down to the supermarket, you grab a chicken, and that's basically a dinosaur. That's kind of true. Birds were evolved from dinosaurs, as we've recently probably heard. Dinosaurs tended to have feathers on them now. That's kind of what's coming out, that dinosaurs probably had feathers on them that were very colourful and whatever else. So birds are descended from dinosaurs. That's not wrong, that's right. But to say that they're the closest thing we have is probably not right. Tuatara are the closest thing that we have, because they really, apart from crocodiles and a couple of other different species, and alligators I should say, they're different. Apart from those, there's really nothing else that we have that is the same. That is a dinosaur basically, or lived when the dinosaurs were around, and you can point to that and go, that's what they looked like that time ago. You can't point to a chicken and go, that's what they looked like all millions of years ago. You can do that with a tuatara. You can say, what I'm looking at right now, that's what they looked like millions of years ago. So they haven't really changed a hell of a lot. So that's why we call them living fossils, and that's partly why they're so interesting, and why we sort of, you can say New Zealand is the land time forgot, is because it really just forgot Tuatara existed. They just hung around and they've just not changed. So what do they eat? What do they eat? So they eat insects, small lizards, and small birds. So that's the sort of things that they tend to eat. The problem is, out of those 3, you can only feed them one thing if you're looking after them in a captive setting. You can't even feed them small birds, because that's things like fantails and other stuff, and Doc doesn't like that. Doesn't like you catching fantails and stuff. Pi waka waka, I think is how you pronounce it, the Māori term, or the Māori word. Small lizards, you also can't do that, because small lizards are things like otago skinks that are extremely rare, and fantails are extremely rare as well. So you can't feed them; they're all endangered. And there's certain insects you can feed them, but those tend to be ones that you'll find all the time. So we feed them things like dragonfly larvae, mealworms, and occasionally locusts as well, and the locusts were actually live, so they chased them down, which is really interesting, because the locusts actually are really dumb. I think locusts must be really dumb, because I've got a video that I will try and put up somewhere that of a tuatara actually just looking down at a locust, and he's just like, the locust just doesn't care, like, and the tuatara's like right next to him. It's really strange. So locusts are really dumb, so tuatara will run around and catch them, and but you can't feed them things like weta, which is also what they normally eat out in the wild, because they're also, kind of rare and native and all that sort of stuff. So they're actually quite, not difficult, but you can't really feed them what they naturally eat out in the wild. The other thing actually I'll mention as well is that you can't feed them live mealworms, because as we're going to talk about in a minute, they're actually so slow that their digestive system can't digest them fast enough. Basically, if the mealworm is alive and it doesn't get killed on the way, basically it doesn't get killed when it's chewed, it'll swallow it live, and the mealworm actually remain alive inside of the tuatara's stomach as some sort of like weird sarlacc type thing from Star Wars, and basically it'll be alive long enough to actually burrow out of the tuatara's stomach, and that's obviously not great. That's bad for the tuatara, so we don't do that. You feed them dead mealworms. We only really feed them live locusts. So this is kind of the part of the entire podcast and of this episode in general where we acknowledge sex is a thing, people have it, so we're going to talk about later in the podcast probably, but we also acknowledge animals have sex too, right? I probably should have said that at the start of the episode. This is going to be a bit of a, perhaps kind of, not really sex heavy, but we're going to talk about sex a bit, because as probably any zookeeper or anything like that will tell you, sex is a major part of their job, trying to get animals to have sex, which is just, it sounds really wrong, and I get that, it doesn't sound right, but that's essentially what you're trying to do. If you've got a rare animal, you're trying to get it to, get a bit frisky with each other, because you want to have more of them, right? That's how you make babies, right? So that's what we want to happen. So, my job entailed trying to make Tuatara have sex with each other. And that's hard, as it turns out, because it's not a case of, I think I said this in episode 1, it's not a case of taking a male and a female, putting them in a room, turning down the lights, putting on some Barry White, and then just leaving them to it. You can't do that like you can with other animals, where it just kind of happens. Tuatara doesn't just happen. The reason for that is because Tuatara, the female Tuatara, need to be able to see two males fighting. They'll just refuse to breed if they don't see two or more males fighting, I should say. Because she wants to know, who's the strongest, right? She wants to know who's the best, who's going to give the best offspring, who's got the best genes. Easiest way to figure that out, see a whole bunch of fellas beat each other up until one of them basically doesn't run away. That's basically the gist of it. So that means you can't just put a male and a female in an enclosure. You actually have to have males together fighting it out before that will happen. Before the female before you can even bother to put the female in. There's just no point in doing it before then. So watching them fight is actually really, really cool. I've only seen them fight a few times because they don't fight very often. Again, we'll explain that in a minute. But they don't fight very often, but when they do fight, boy howdy is it awesome. They will use their teeth, their claws, they'll bite each other, swipe at each other, hit each other with their tails. They get bleeding lips, bleeding sides, all sorts of different stuff. And so it's really quite grisly to watch them. And I had a few people actually at my old job, they'd freak out and they'd come running out going, "Oh my god, Tuatara, they're killing each other, they've got blood everywhere." And I'll be like, "Oh, okay, weird." So you come out back and you have a look, and they're like, "Oh, look, he's got a bleeding lip and stuff." And you're like, "Oh, I don't care about that." And they're like, "Oh, really?" And you're like, "Oh, yeah, no, as long as he's not disemboweled, it doesn't matter." If you're going to wrap them up in cotton wool, then you're not going to learn anything, right? If I pulled them apart every single time they fought, neither of them would end up being more dominant than the other, which is what we want. So you can't, if they're not got a life-threatening injury, that's just, bleeding lips, bleeding sides, all that sort of stuff, that's all part of it. Cuts and grazes, that's all part of it. That's how you learn. That's life, right? So, yeah, so you'd have two males fight each other out until one of them became more clearly dominant than the other. The problem with that is that you can't actually figure out who's the most dominant just by looking at them, just like as a one-off. You have to do it gradually over a period of time, because Tuatara are... they move so... Not they don't move slow, I shouldn't say that. They don't do much, so it's very difficult to find out just from looking at them which one's more dominant. There are ways to figure it out. We found ways to figure it out just because we knew our Tuatara so well. But, in general, you have to watch them over a period of time. And, it can change and from month to month and that sort of thing as well. So, as I've sort of kind of hinted at, Tuatara don't do much. They're not very active. They're really active when they're fighting. I've actually seen one on a log. He jumped off the log and then pinned the other Tuatara beneath his foot. That was bloody cool. But there's no, they don't do a lot generally other than that. When they're fighting, that's really exciting. When they're trying to chase up something, that's really exciting. That's maybe half of the percent of the time that they're doing stuff. The rest of the time, they're doing absolutely nothing. They're just not doing anything. And there's a couple of main reasons for that. The first one is they've got a really slow physiology. So there's not a lot going on the inside. So it means not a lot's going on the outside. By that, I mean, on the inside, they've probably got one heartbeat per every 10 to 15 minutes at peak winter, so when it's the coldest. So they've got a heartbeat per every 10 to 15 minutes. And they can have a breath for every half an hour to an hour. So, there's really not a lot going on the inside in terms of physiology. I don't mean like in their brain. Well, I don't know how smart they are, to be fair. But anyway, the other thing that's really interesting is that, or the other reason that they don't do a lot, is because they have a really long lifespan. So they are estimated to live anywhere between 200 250 years old, thereabouts. So they can get really, really old. They're actually some of the oldest lived animals on the planet. The oldest, I believe, is a shark that can live to about 400-500 years. So they get pretty old in the grand scheme of things. And the oldest living tuatara in captivity is Henry, the tuatara down in Invercargill, who is about 120-ish. They're not quite sure how old he is because I don't believe he was bred in captivity, so they're not 100% sure how old he is. But Henry's really interesting because he didn't actually start breeding until he was probably about 110, 111, which is obviously pretty old. It's older than me, anyway. And so Henry didn't breed until he was, about middle-aged for him, actually. If you live for 200 years and you're about 100 years old, he's only probably about 40 years old or whatever in human years. So he's actually not that old, in terms of being a tuatara anyway. But he didn't start breeding until then, and that was, again, for a couple of different reasons. The first, they thought it was a brain tumour. They initially found, I think it was a brain tumour. It was some sort of tumour. They thought he had a tumour, so they did some surgery on him, cut him open, took it out, stitched him back up, and went, cool, he's good to go now. He's going to get frisky with some of those other ladies in there, and he didn't. He just didn't care. And there were the guys at the Southland Museum, which is where he lives. Actually, he's probably not going to live there anymore. It's been deemed earthquake unsafe, so maybe not soon. But he has previously lived at the Southland Museum, I think under the watchful eye of Lloyd Esler, who is, if you do anything with tuatara in New Zealand, Lloyd Esler is the guy. He's the tuatara guy. I have had the privilege of meeting him once or twice in my life when I was a very young lad, and he is an absolutely amazing guy. His enthusiasm is infectious. He is absolutely amazing. So I don't know if he still works for the Southland Museum. It's been a number of years since I've had to think about him, essentially. But yeah, he's a fantastic guy. Absolutely the best. I cannot recommend him enough as a tuatara guy. As a general, just stand up bloke. He's fantastic. But anyway, so Henry's in he's in the Southland Museum, and he had a tumour taken out, and he still doesn't want to shag his missus. So they eventually discovered that it was because the roof or the ceiling in his enclosure was actually made of a material that blocked UV light, and they need UV light to keep their bones nice and strong, vitamin D, all that sort of hoo-ha. So they need that, and that roof was actually stopping that UV light getting through, so that was a huge problem. So they basically ripped all the roof out, put it all back on with different stuff, and then went, right, he should be getting busy now. And he eventually did, but it was all in tuatara time, it took a bit longer. But he did eventually breed, and now he's got kids all over the show and all this sort of stuff. So that's great. They eventually got it, but it was a bit of a struggle in general. So Henry is I think cooked straight tuatara. I want to say cooked straight tuatara. I'm not 100% sure on that, but he's a fairly. He's not the big important breed, if you want to put it that way. The big important, not breed, he's the species. The big important species is the Brothers Island tuatara. So the brothers, they were mentioned in episode 3, plug, of that we talked about Kupe and Tawheki. So the brothers are, according to that story, or that version of the story, they were made by cutting out the eyes, I think, if I remember rightly, of Tawheki and throwing them into the sea. And so the brothers are a group of islands. I think it's a group of 3 islands just outside the Marlborough Sound, so at the top or the north end of the South Island. And these islands are the only place you can find Brothers Island tuatara, hence the name, because explorers in the 18th got there century and 19th century even are just really boring and they don't name things anything interesting. That's why we call it North Island and South Island and all sorts of other boring stuff. But yeah, so the Brothers Islands are the only place you can find the Brothers Island Tuatara, and then the most rare Tuatara, because there's only about 400 of them left, which is just that's just bugger all. Like, that's nothing. You know, there are scientific theories out there that basically say 500 is the like bare absolute minimum that you have to have a viable population. I mean, those scientific theories are disputed and may or may not be wrong, depending on who you ask again. But, you know, 400 is not a lot. You know, that's the gist of it. 400 is not a lot. So, of those 400, only 40 of them are female, which is, again, really not a lot. And that's a really big problem, because the males are, well, the females, I should say, are the ones who are doing all the legwork when it comes to breeding. They're all the ones who, you know, are putting all the most time and energy. They're the ones laying the eggs, hatching the eggs, you know, all that sort of stuff. The males, in typical male fashion, you know, they're in it for the root and then they bugger off. So the females are the ones that you really want more of, because the females, if you have, for example, you say you have, you know, 5 males and 100 females. Those 5 males, assuming that they have, you know, unlimited energy, they can go around and you know, and breed with all of those females. And all of those females will become pregnant, again, in theory, you know, and so it will, you know, you will be able to get all those females pregnant, and that's great. You have 100 different clutches by 5 males. That's still not ideal, but I mean, I don't want to offend the females in the audience, but, you know, in this scenario, the females are the baby factories. You know, you've got 100 different factories working there. Whereas if you reverse it, you've got 5 females and 100 males. You've only got 5 factories. You know, all of those males can breed with those females all the bloody hell they like, and you're not going to get any more, you know, any more eggs out of them, basically. You're not going to get any more than they can physically produce. You're not going to get that in the 100 females example either, but you've got 100 factories versus 5 factories, if that sort of makes sense. I do apologise to the females out there. You're not just baby factories, but it's easy to think about it that way. Anyway, so the main question there is, why do we have a discrepancy or a ratio that's not 1-to-1, more or less? Like, you know, most species on the planet have a 1-to-1 ratio of males to females, and the reason for that is because Tuatara are temperature sex dependent, which basically means that the average temperature of the soil that the eggs are kept in determines the gender of the animal later on in life. So for Tuatara specifically, if you have higher temperatures, you tend to get males, and lower temperatures, you tend to get females. So for Tuatara, it's specifically above and below 20 degrees. So above 20 degrees, you tend to get males. Below 20 degrees, you tend to get females. Okay, this is not 100%. This is not, not perfect. You're not always going to get males, you know, above that threshold, but you tend to find a higher proportion of males, if that makes sense. So because of the, you know, global warming and all sorts of other things that are going on at the moment. Sorry, not global warming, climate change. We should call it climate change, not global warming. So because of climate change and the globe is warming, we are tending to get higher temperatures, and, you know, we're getting above that 20 degree threshold more regularly than not. So that does mean we are tending to get more males than females being born, which is giving us that, you know, 40 to 360 ratio, which is bad, as we mentioned before. So that's not what we want. So ideally we want more females. So there's no point getting more males. Who cares about males? Not me, that's who. So we don't care about males for Tuatara, Brothers Island Tuatara in any case. So we want to get more females. So any eggs that get taken, or, you know, get taken out of enclosures from successful breeding pairs will be kept under that 20 degree threshold. And the reason we take those eggs out, for anyone who thinks we're like baby snatching or whatever, is the reason that we do that is because when the eggs hatch, you're always baby Tuatara running around. That's great. Baby Tuatara running around is fantastic. Problem is, male Tuatara are what I like to call incestuous cannibals. By that, I mean what they'll do is males will walk around their territory looking for small Tuatara, for baby Tuatara, and they'll eat any baby tuatara they come across. The theory being, or the sort of idea behind that being that if they eat a rival's offspring, then that increases their possibility, or that increases the probability, I should say, of their offspring being more successful, right? Because there's less competition between, other offspring tuatara. And that's great out in the wild. That works, right? That works out in the wild. So they're cannibals, right? But they're incestuous cannibals because they don't discern whether that's, his offspring or not. He doesn't know that. There's no way to tell. So he'll just eat whatever he comes across. And that works out in the wild because, again, they won't come across their own offspring usually. So it's not a huge issue out in the wild. But if you're just got males and females in an enclosure, there's nowhere for those males to go. There's nowhere for those little offspring to go. So he'll just eat his own offspring. Just they come out of the burrow and they go, oh, this is quite exciting. And then fucking gulp, they're gone. That's it. So you want to remove the eggs because otherwise they will actually just get eaten. So, that's why they do that. So we try to breed them up so we can get some more females is the gist of that. And it takes a really long time to breed them. As we mentioned, that tuatara don't do much. There's a difference. Tuatara, a lot of people think are they're slow. They're not slow. They can be fast. I've seen them move real fast. They're just lazy. There's a slight difference in that. The main difference being that if you're lazy, you can move fast. You just don't want to move very fast very often. So that's why, tuatara, they don't do much. They're lazy. They're not slow. They're lazy. So it takes a long time for them to do anything. Breeding being one of those things. So the tuatara that we were trying to breed, we had two Brothers Island males, and those males have been fighting for the last 5 years, right? So that's a long time to be having a scrap with another guy. And the thing is that that fight could go on for the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years plus before we actually see, one of them become continuously dominant, which is, for more than a year, which was the sort of threshold that we sort of determined that's what we were going to go, right? If one of them's more dominant for longer than a year, then we know he's probably going to stay dominant. So that was the threshold that we set. And I never saw it in the time that I worked there. So, it takes a long time. So it could take a long time. It could take 100 plus years before they actually decide to fight. But, decide who's going to be the most dominant. But then, say they do actually finish having their fight and they decide who's the most dominant in a reasonable amount of time, then you still have to wait. You put the female in and you still have to wait for her to decide, who she wants to breed with and that sort of stuff, and that can take some time because she doesn't know what's going on or why it's happening, so that could take another few years. Their breeding cycles anywhere between, I think, like 7 to 10 years or thereabouts. I think it's roughly 7 years, so it can take a long time for them to actually sort themselves out and that sort of thing as well. And then they actually breed, and then the eggs get laid and then they hatch. And then you go, okay, cool, I've got offspring tuatara, I can release those out into the wild. Well, no, you can't actually, because you want to release them out into the wild so that they can become, that they can breed with other wild tuatara, right? That's the point. You want to breed other wild tuatara with these captive ones when you release them so that you can breed tuatara out in the wild properly, proper wild tuatara. So there's no point in releasing them if they're not going to breed with other wild tuatara. And these tuatara that you've just hatched won't. Why? Because they are immature. They're sexually immature. And I can hear you saying, well, Thomas, when do they become sexually immature? Surely it's only like a couple years away. She'll be right. No, it's 2 decades. It's 20 years before a hatched tuatara will become sexually mature. It takes a bloody long time. So the problem is, it can take decades from going from, okay, I've got tuatara now, I'd like to breed them, to then go, yeah, let's put tuatara out into the wild. It takes decades. It could take anywhere between 50 to 75 years for it to happen. This is kind of assuming as well that, your bare minimum is 25 to 50 years probably before you'll actually get tuatara out into the wild. And that's just probably assuming nothing's going to go wrong, right? And something's going to go wrong. This is very complicated stuff. I mean, it's not very complicated, but you're dealing with a lot of biological processes and animals that want to do their own thing and all sorts of stuff. So you are dealing with a whole bunch of different processes that any one of those things could go wrong. And if any one of those things could go wrong, the whole thing comes crashing down. So you need, it can take a long time. So realistically, you're potentially looking at 50 to 75 years. And before you can go from, Tuatara that you might be able to breed to going to sending them out into the wild and, you actually having something to basically show for it. That's a long time. 50 to 75 years is a long time. I'm 24. I don't intend to be lasting much longer than probably 75 years from now. I mean, if I make it 75 years from now, I'll be in my 90s. So, that's pretty bloody good. So that's the problem that we have, is that Tuatara last a long time, so they do everything in a long time. So what's good about that, if there is a good side, is that there are things in place for, if you're working at a zoo or whatever and your entire team dies, because I don't know why, but say you all die in a freak car accident or something, there are processes in place for things to be handed over, for these Tuatara to be handed over, because I mean, although, if the entire team at Wellington Zoo or Auckland Zoo or Hamilton Zoo or whatever would all just die overnight, it's not like they're just going to abandon all the animals, but Tuatara have this special sort of thing because they're called taonga, right? Or they are taonga, right? Which I'm not pronouncing very well, which does sound very similar to taonga, right? Taonga is a priest or a expert in something. Generally, it's the stories say it's a priest. But they're taonga, right? I think I said it better that time, taonga. Right, taonga, if you remember from earlier episodes, I'll give you a second to try and guess what that means. Good. Did you get it? It means treasure. So what it means is that they're considered basically culturally important, because they're so rare and that sort of thing, and also because you can't find them anywhere else, and all that sort of stuff, and they hold cultural significance to Māori from the past and that sort of thing as well, in their history and that sort of stuff, which we'll talk about in the podcast as well at some point. Lizards in general, they're not lizards, but and lizards and reptiles in general do have a cultural significance as well, again, that we'll talk about, but there is processes in place for people to look after them. So, iwi, the Māori tribes, the iwi, they'll look after them, or they'll swoop in along with Doc and a whole bunch of other people. They'll swoop in and, grab them or whatever. So, there are processes in place to avoid them just being left on the wayside, essentially. Not that we'd leave any animals on the wayside, but Tuatara are specifically significant, along with a number of other animals as well. Anyway, to go from talking about all that, so one of the other species is the cook straight Tuatara, as mentioned earlier. There is another species, as we kind of mentioned, called the northern Tuatara, but again, what species is what? Is it actually a species? Whatever. So the two sort of big ones are the Brothers Island and the Cook Strait Tuatara. And there's about 100,000 of them left, which is really, really good. There's a lot more of them. And you tend to find these Cook Strait Tuatara, you can only find Tuatara on offshore islands. So any islands that are, some of them are quite far off the New Zealand coast, some of them are really, really close and they just sit, in Fiordland or all that sort of thing, but they're not connected to the mainland. But you can't find any Tuatara left on mainland New Zealand. By mainland New Zealand, I mean North Island, South Island and Stewart Island. Those are the three big islands. You don't find any Tuatara on any of those islands. In the wild, I should say. Obviously, you find them in zoos and captivity and stuff. So you can't find any Tuatara in the wild on the mainland. Sorry, you can, sort of. They do have what they call mainland islands, which are basically just areas where they've put predator-proof fence, which costs something like $1,000 per 10 meters or something ridiculous. But those mainland islands are basically massive fenced-off areas that they put, kiwi and takahe and all sorts of other things in there to try and, bring them back. And Tuatara are sometimes found in those as well, depending on where you go. Sometimes they're found in enclosures. So that statement's not 100% accurate, but what I'm trying to get across is if you go out into the middle of the bush and expect to go find a Tuatara, in North Island or the South Island, you're gonna be shit out of luck. You're not gonna see anything. you can only find them on those offshore islands, and that's because, DOC has tried to put them there. DOC is the Department of Conservation. I don't know if I mentioned that, but they're Department of Conservation is a self-explanatory title, isn't it? But they are put there so that they can be, bred up and, avoid from predators and that sort of thing. So, again, coming back to, all those rats and things that we've talked about in previous episodes as well, and we'll talk a bit about them in a minute as well. So that's only where you can find them. So that's only where you can find Cook Strait Tuatara. The main one that you can find them is Stevens Island. That's the sort of the tourist trap, if you want to sort of put it that way. It's not a tourist trap, but that's the one that, most people go, oh wow, you found Tuatara, where'd you go see those? 99% of people go, oh yeah, I went to Stevens Island and saw them there. So Stevens Island is kind of the most famous one, if you will, but you can find them all over the show if you kind of, ask your local eyesight or, dock office or anything like that. They'll point you in the right direction. So Cook Strait Tuatara is the other really, really big one. I'm just looking at my notes here, sorry, because I have made a little bit of notes just so I don't derail too much, but I have derailed a lot, actually, which is not great. So we've talked about how, I think we've talked about, under 20, they don't actually have a gender. That's why they're not sexually mature. I don't know if I mentioned that. So when they're under 20, the reason that they're not sexually mature is because they don't have a gender. They don't actually, they develop a gender they determine the gender in the egg stage, but it actually doesn't develop until they're about 20 years old. So that is why we have to wait that period. It's not like, we can, it's not like it's there, really. It's in the genes, it's in the chromosomes, it's all that sort of stuff. They quote-unquote know what they're going to be, but it won't develop until they're about 20 years old. So it's actually, we can't even breed them even if we wanted to. And it's really interesting because I used to get a lot of people when they ask me, can you tell which, whether they're going to be a male or a female? The answer is kind of not really. You sort of can. Maybe because, ones might be bigger and ones might be smaller, and you can go, oh, that might be a male, that might be a female. It's not really a good way to do it, though. There's a whole bunch of different things going on there, and there's not really any good way, to be honest, at all. The main way that you can do it is you can take a Tuatara, and I think there's a bunch of people that they've got special machines and they can do all this weird stuff, and it costs thousands of dollars to do it, but they can do it that way, and they can tell that way if you've got the cash money to do it. But the other way to do it is to basically get the Tuatara, flip it on its back, get a scalpel, cut it open, and see what's inside. And that's great. That's 100% pretty much I think it's it's pretty accurate. You're not, if you know what you're doing, you're not gonna bugger that up. The problem with that is if you then want to stitch the Tuatara back up and then put it back into the enclosure to breed later on, that procedure tends to be fatal. So it's not a very good way of doing it. So there's not really a good way to figure out what gender they're going to become. So you really just gotta kind of hope that it's the right gender that you want. There's not really a way to do it. So other interesting things about Tuatara, as we talked about, is their taonga, their treasures, meaning they have a higher cultural significance. The other thing is if they bite you. So if they bite you, Tuatara have two rows of teeth up the top on the upper jaw and one row of teeth on the lower jaw, and all three of those rows of teeth are serrated, so they've got little jaggedy edges on them that they use to help grind things up and chew things and stuff. So if they bite you, they're actually going to grind that those teeth on your finger, or whatever they've got, to basically try and saw blade it off and grind it down and all that sort of stuff. And I haven't experienced it, but I'm told it's not great. And of course you're saying, oh, that's fine, I'll just pull it off, that's okay, I'll just open its jaws, I'll get my mate to open its jaws and pull my finger out or whatever. Oh, that's very nice, if it wasn't for a piece of legislation that said you couldn't do that. It's actually illegal to do that, as far as I'm aware. I haven't actually read the legislation, so citation needed. As I said, this is very off the cuff and a bit more a bit more rough. So, a lot of this stuff, don't take it to be 100% accurate. It might be 99% accurate or 70% accurate. This is the more dubious part of the story, but it's really good for foreigners, right? They'll believe anything when you're standing up there talking about Tuatara and that sort of thing. By this point you've already got them, and they're enthralled. So if you tell them they're not allowed to put, they're not allowed to pull their finger out, that scares them. So that's always a good thing. I'm reasonably certain it's accurate, but I'm not sure how accurate it is. But yeah, so you're not actually allowed to pull your finger out. It's actually illegal. So don't do that. If you ever encounter a tuatara, don't try and put your finger in its face to try and bite you, because one, it'll be really painful, and two, you'll be screaming at your friend to please pull your finger out, and he'll say, no, I'm not allowed. And the third thing you'll be thinking is, oh, that's fine, this is only going to be going on for 5 minutes or whatever, I'll just tough it out, right? You're a big, strong person, you can tough this out. You can sit there and wait for a tuatara to, grind your finger down for 5 minutes. And that's great. Good for you. You're a big, strong person. Good for you. There's just one sort of flaw in your plan here. Tuatara won't actually let go until they take their next breath. And those of you who were listening really intently will remember that I said they won't actually take another breath for anywhere upwards of half an hour to an hour. So you could be there sometime in a reasonable amount of pain, waiting for this tuatara to let go of you, screaming at your buddy to do something about it, and your buddy's going to go, no thank you, I don't want a fine. So don't do that. If you encounter any tuatara or anything like that, it's pretty rare that you'll get a chance to actually touch a tuatara, or get close enough to actually try and put your finger in its mouth. But don't do that if you're going to do that. The other thing is, if you ever encounter a tuatara, don't give a yank on its tail. Don't do that, because like a lot of other like a lot of other lizards, not other lizards, they're not lizards either. Like a lot of other reptiles, they will actually lose their tail if you pull on it. So if you give it a decent enough tug, so it'll actually fall off, and it will grow back, but it will take a number of years for it to grow back. So it does take quite a long time, and the reason that they do that is because, as you've probably heard with other reptiles, is, birds of prey will come down, grab the tail, try and drag or fly away with the reptile, and they lose the tail to, the bird flies away with the tail, and the reptile lives to fight another day. So the big one of the predators of tuatara, they don't have many predators, but their sort of kind of main one is birds of prey, right? And so that's why they have that defense mechanism. It's also why they don't actually move a lot. Because if a bird is flying overhead, right, you're a nice falcon, New Zealand falcon, don't find them anywhere else in the world. You got a nice New Zealand falcon, he's flying over the bush and he's looking down, because that's what they have. Birds have very good eyesight, because that's how they find things to eat. So he's looking down with his great big eyes, and he's looking for something to eat. If you move, he's more likely to see you, right? Rather than if you stand still, because tuatara are very good at camouflage. They're nice and green. They blend into the bush, into the leaf litter. So they're very difficult to spot if they're not moving. If they move around, much easier to spot. So they don't move around, because then they'll be less likely to be eaten. That doesn't quite work if you are being chased by a stoat. For example, a stoat has an olfactory sense, right? So it uses its nose, it's using its schnoz, it's trying to smell you out. And it doesn't work if you're standing still, the stoat's just going to look at you once it finds you by smelling it. It's going to look at you and go, man, that was easy, I'm just going to run it down and eat it. And so that's a big problem. And the other defense mechanism they sort of have is they'll be able to run into the burrow and, hide from a bird, basically. But you can't do that with a stoat. A stoat, similar to a weasel and a ferret, it's just going to run into that burrow with you. It doesn't care. It's just going to run in there and fight you and eat you or your eggs, whatever. It doesn't care. Stoats are mean bastards. So it's a really big problem that their defense mechanism that they've developed for their own predators isn't very good for, stoats and rats and other things. Rats, being nest robbers, so they're not fighting tuataras directly. But yeah, they're everything that Tuatara basically developed is really bad for, all these introduced predators that were brought in, like stoats, possums, and rats are the three sort of really big ones that you'll probably hear. So they're exotic mammals, so they're brought from the outside. And that's a really big problem in and of itself that I could go on and on and on about, but we're already running at 45-ish minutes now, and we don't want to be running probably for more than an hour. I did say this was going to be half an hour, so let's not get too off the rails. So yeah, that's pretty much everything that I want to talk about. The last couple of things I want to talk about is Tuatara are the only species of reptile that have a third eye. So they don't actually have an eye per se. Their eye is a photoreceptor in the center of their forehead. So it manifests itself as sort of a silvery dot when they're very, very young, and then you can't see it as they get older. So they actually just use that as a photoreceptor, right? It's basically just is there light? Yes, no. That's all it does, basically. And it's used specifically for UV light, so they can tell whether, there is enough UV light in an area, whether they need to move to another area, that kind of stuff. As I said, because their bones, and their teeth and that sort of thing, they need it to keep, nice and strong and healthy and that sort of stuff. So that's basically what Henry, as we talked about earlier, that's what he would have been using to figure out, is this, do I want to breed? Well, no, because I don't have enough UV light, because my third eye is telling me I don't have enough UV light. And then when they changed the ceiling, he would have gone, oh yeah, I've got enough UV light. The silvery dot is giving me a thumbs up. So that's all good. Let's have a root. So, that's what it's used for, basically, is as a photoreceptor. And the other sort of couple of things is they like to live anywhere between 5 and 25 degrees. Anything above 25 and they start dying. Degrees being degrees Celsius, not freedom units, Fahrenheit. We don't use Fahrenheit. That's a weird system and I don't understand it. Celsius makes sense. So Celsius is what we use. So 5 to 25 degrees Celsius is what they generally prefer. So they like it quite cold in comparison to, say, your Australian animals, just across the ditch, as they say. They like it anywhere between 30, 40 plus-ish degrees. They like it really hot because Australia is really hot, whereas New Zealand's not that hot, so they like it much, much colder generally. Anything above sort of 25 to 30 and they start dying, which is not good, obviously. So, they do like it quite cold in comparison to many other animals, or many other reptiles, I should say. And the last thing I'll say is I did mention actually about at the start we were going to talk about how they sort of why the raised spines means what it does. Well, I'm putting it at the end now because I forgot. As this is rough, I already said that. So the reason that they raise their spines, is for the fighting, right? Makes them look bigger and scarier and that sort of thing. When they actually fight, they'll actually raise themselves off the ground as well. The reason they keep themselves on the ground is because Tuatara don't actually have any ears. Which is another interesting thing that I've just remembered, so we'll talk about that. So they don't have any ears, so they actually keep their bellies on the ground to try and, figure out, try and feel vibrations, basically, to figure out if anything's coming along and trying to eat them and that sort of stuff, which again is like, fairly rare. I'm guessing it's more used if a moa was going to step on you or something. Again, because they're being predated on by falcons and stuff that are in the air. So Tuatara don't have ears, and that's a problem because the main way to figure out whether a Tuatara is how old it is, basically, is to get the ear bones, like you do with other reptiles and fish. You take an ear bone out called the otolith, and that's very, very common in reptiles and fish, is to take out this otolith, which is a tiny, tiny ear bone. You sand it down, put it under a microscope, and you count the growth rings on it like you would on a tree. So one ring basically equals 1 year, and that's a shit of a job. I can tell you that because I did that at uni, and it's a shit of a job. You spend hours looking under a microscope, and it's crap, and I hated it. But I drew the short straw that day, so, but yeah, the otolith, you look at that and you go, yeah, that's how old it is. The problem is that partially is because that requires the animal to be dead, so that's not ideal, but also they don't have ears. Tuatara don't have ears, so they don't have ear bones to do it. So that's a massive problem. And the other way to do it is to basically take a tooth, cut it in half, and then do the same thing. You count the growth rings on it. The problem with that is the reason that method works is because other reptiles and fish, their teeth are separate to the skull structure, right? So your teeth, you sitting at home, driving in a car, walking to work, in an operating theatre, you know who you are. Your teeth are in the gums, right? They're in the gums. They're not actually attached to the skull structure. So that means that your teeth grow independently of the rest of your body. So your teeth will actually grow at the same rate every year, or for I don't know if it's like that for people, but it's like that for reptiles and fish. They'll grow at the same rate every single year. So that's why this method works, right? That's why the otolith method works, is because that otolith only produces one ring a year. So that's good. That's what you want, right? It's a consistent, solid rate every single year. The problem, and that again, that works for fish and reptiles. The problem with Tuatara is that their teeth are attached to the skull structure. They're actually just protrusions of the jawbone, essentially, through the gums, right? So their teeth are attached to the skull, or the mandible if it's the bottom jaw. So the problem with that is the skull doesn't hold to that rule. It doesn't grow the same amount every single year. It grows depending on, how much food you've eaten and stuff. Some years it'll grow more, some years it'll grow less, some years it might not grow at all, some years it might shrink as you get older, that kind of stuff. So that's a problem, because if you're not getting that consistent growth every single year, you're not going to produce the same amount of rings every single year. You're not going to grow one ring a year, which is what you want. So you might have a couple of rings one year, one ring another year, no rings one year, and that's not good. That's not what you want. That doesn't tell you anything. So that's why that doesn't work. That's not a method we can use to figure out how old Tuatara get. And that's why we don't quite know how old they are. That's why I said it's estimated that they get to about 200, 250 years old, because actually no one knows how old they get. The prevailing science at the moment to figure out how old they get is waiting for Henry to die. That's kind of it. We have guesses, and we have, there's been things done and whatever else, and generally you'll hear people say, they live for like 100 years plus and that kind of thing, but no one quite knows, as far as I'm aware. No one quite knows how old they get. 200, 250 years old is kind of, I think it's the outside limit. It is kind of the outside limit, and it probably isn't that much, but that's sort of, we don't really know. There's not really any way to tell, really, because there's no way to age them properly. So that's kind of where the science is at on that. We're all just sitting around waiting for Henry to die, and as we said, the problem with that is he might last quite a while. He's already lasted a while. He might last a while longer. So it's a long process. It's a big, long process with Tuatara. So with that, I think we're running up to close to an hour now that I've been ranting about Tuatara. So thank you for listening if you have made it this far. I do apologise for the fact that it is very rough, that it is a lot of me umming and ahhing and making weird mouth sounds. I hope you can make it through all of that if you have made it through all of that. But thank you for getting through all of this and listening to me rant about Tuatara a little bit. I don't get to do this anymore since I don't work directly with native animals anymore. So I really like when I get the chance to rant about animals and talk about them, even if it is just into my microphone in my room on my own, looking like a lunatic. But hopefully you enjoyed it, and that's the main thing. The audience out there, hopefully you enjoyed it, and hopefully you enjoyed a little bit of an insight into, I guess, how insane I am. I guess when I just talk about animals and things that I'm passionate about when I don't have a script. This is unfiltered, unadulterated me. So hopefully you did enjoy that a little bit as well, a view into who I am and what I am about and that sort of thing. So again, thank you if you've made it this far, and thank you, I guess. Should I be thanking? I guess. Thank you to the French History Podcast for let's call it what it is, bullying me into doing this. It was really fun. I do really enjoy, as I said, talking about this sort of stuff. So thank you, French History Podcast. Go check out his stuff. if you're interested in French history. I have admittedly not listened to his content yet. I'm still working on getting through a whole bunch of others at the moment, because once you start becoming a history podcaster, a whole bunch of people go, hey, look, I'm also a history podcaster, and it's great. I love it. I've got this massive list of history podcasts that I want to listen to, but I have not made it around to the French history podcast yet, so I am sorry if you are listening to this. So I cannot endorse whether it's any good, but I'm sure it is. Lots of history podcasters are absolutely fantastic. There's a lot out there, and I'm sure French History Podcast does a bloody good job if his tweets anything to go by. I really enjoy looking at his tweets and the tweets of everyone else with all the interesting stuff that they do. Out on, showing maps and books, and it's great. So if you're anyway interested in that sort of stuff, there's a whole bunch out there. Just look on Twitter, or drop me a line, and I can recommend some to you as well. So with that, if you want to get in touch with me, I am on Twitter at History Aotearoa, or on Facebook at History of Aotearoa New Zealand Podcast. There we go, get it right. Or you can find me on Gmail at historyaotearoa@gmail.com. Aotearoa spelled Aotearoa. As always, haere tu atu, hoki tu mai. See you next time.